Hi, my name is Anthony Mongillo. I'm thrilled to introduce the topic of the effect of 4 first premolar extractions on the posterior Bolton ratio. I know this isn't exactly an easy read, but I'd like to share some clinical implications and practical solutions that were discovered while undertaking this research. First off, let's start with the name that we all know, Bolton. Dr. Bolton discovered a ratio that would describe ideal occlusion and used a mathematical formula to predict occlusal outcomes before even placing a single bracket. Today we use the anterior Bolton ratio to predict whether anterior teeth may need buildups or IPR to achieve a good occlusal outcome. While I was a resident working up orthodontic treatment plans, I noticed that we really only paid attention to the anterior ratio. I wondered why we even bothered with overall ratio when all it represents is the sum of its parts, the anterior and posterior teeth. What was even more strange was that no one knew what the posterior Bolton ratio was. As enigmatic as the posterior Bolton ratio was, to me it seemed important for predicting good posterior occlusion, just like the anterior ratio is used for predicting anterior occlusion. So I set out to describe the posterior Bolton ratio by finding a sample that matches Bolton's. After successfully matching Bolton's sample, I was able to calculate that the posterior Bolton ratio is 105.77%. Great, we could stop there because the posterior Bolton ratio may be clinically handy for predicting posterior occlusion issues in non-extraction cases. But we're not done because we must recognize that in extraction cases, the posterior ratio could change significantly. Since extracting 4 first premolars is a common extraction pattern, I wondered, how does the posterior Bolton ratio change after extracting 4 first premolars? Is what we expect by mathematical computation of the posterior Bolton ratio actually observed clinically? And what occlusal outcomes do we observe in these cases? Finally, I wondered if there were any factors that were good predictors of occlusal outcomes after extracting 4 first premolars. So I scanned and digitized the 55 cases. Based on Andrew's 6 keys of occlusion, I set anterior teeth to ideal occlusion, digitally extracted all 4 first premolars, then digitally protracted each posterior tooth, 1 tooth at a time, and then set each posterior tooth in ideal occlusion. What I expected to find was ideal posterior occlusion and a new posterior Bolton ratio of 107.29% based on the mathematical formula omitting the width of the extracted 4s. What was observed, however, was that the majority of cases had spacing in the mandibular arch between the second premolar and first molar to the tune of 1.1 millimeters. In fact, 95% of the cases had at least 1 millimeter of space, and for those who don't think that 1 millimeter of space is clinically significant, 27% of the cases finished with at least 1.5 millimeters of space, 16% of cases finished with more than 2 millimeters of space, and 5% of cases finished with greater than 3 millimeters of space. I don't think that's clinically insignificant. All right, so why does the space matter? It matters because complete space closure without any additional clinical considerations such as IPR or posterior buildups may actually compromise ideal occlusion by over-retracting teeth mesial to the extraction space towards class 2, or by over-protracting the mandibular molars towards class 3. So to give clinicians a tool for estimating residual spaces before placing even a single bracket, and certainly before extracting 4 first premolars, we developed a regression equation based on the factors that were correlated most with the size of the space. If the estimated space is deemed clinically significant, a clinician may anticipate occlusal outcomes to be compromised without either building up certain teeth or performing interproximal reduction on others. Now, I acknowledge that this study may not change how you work up your case or how you finish your case, even though it could, but I hope it helps to explain why your all 4s extraction cases tend to finish with either a slight class 2 canine or a slight class 3 molar relationship. Future studies are going to explore different extraction patterns and what those occlusal outcomes look like. Finally, I want to give special thanks to Dr. Foley, who painstakingly abridged my thesis into the manuscript published in the journal. That wraps it up. Study on.